This is a true story, something that happened to me over the course of 3 long years. It's about family and how the people who are supposed to love you the most can sometimes become the cruelest strangers of all. The keys in my hand felt colder and heavier than a tombstone as I watched my own mother plead with me from the other side of the glass storm door. Her face was puffy and blotched with tears, her voice a desperate, thin wail that barely carried over the chirping of the crickets in the late August heat. Behind her, in the shadows of the foyer that was no longer hers, stood Rick, his arms crossed over his chest, a smug, contemptuous smirk twisting his lips. He thought this was a negotiation, a final dramatic scene where I would eventually break. But as my fingers closed around the cool brass of the new key, the one that would fit the brand new deadbolt I was about to install, I knew this wasn't an ending, it was a reckoning. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. It all began the way so many tragedies do, quietly and then all at once. My father died on a Tuesday in April, a heart attack, sudden and massive, in the garden he'd spent 30 years cultivating. One moment he was there, turning over the dark Texas soil in our backyard in Round Rock, just north of Austin, and the next, he was gone. He was my anchor, the quiet, steady presence that balanced out my mother's more chaotic energy. After the funeral, a suffocating silence fell over the house on Primrose Lane, a silence so profound it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. For 6 months, Mom and I existed in that silence, moving around each other like ghosts, the grief a shared shroud we couldn't bring ourselves to cast off. We were adrift, 2 halves of a whole that had been shattered. I thought we would find our way back to shore together. I was wrong. Rick entered our lives like a storm front, all bluster and cheap charm. He was a consultant, he said, a vague and important-sounding title that meant he did little and got paid for even less. He met my mother, Sarah, at a grief support group, a fact I later learned was a complete lie. He'd been trolling the obituaries, a vulture circling the recently bereaved. He had a full, slicked-back head of silver hair that he was far too proud of, a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, and a wardrobe of ridiculously tight, brightly colored polo shirts that strained against his burgeoning beer gut. He smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne, a scent that seemed to permeate every room he entered. From the moment he first walked through our front door, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. He called me kiddo, even though I was 22 and working my first real job as a junior data analyst downtown. He'd pat me on the head with a condescending familiarity that made my skin crawl. He made himself at home with breathtaking speed. Within a week, his oversized golf bag was propped in the corner of the entryway. Within 2, his hideous recliner, a monstrosity of cracked brown leather and mysterious stains, had replaced my father's favorite armchair in the living room. My dad's chair, the one with the worn fabric where his head had rested for countless evenings, was unceremoniously hauled out to the curb for bulk trash pickup without anyone even asking me. I found it sitting in the rain, a discarded piece of my life, and I cried so hard I couldn't breathe. When I confronted my mother, her eyes darted away from mine. "Chloe, honey, we have to move forward," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "Rick says holding on to old things is like holding on to old pain, Rick says." That phrase would become the soundtrack to my life unraveling. "Rick says we should sell Dad's old truck. Rick says the garden is too much work to maintain. Rick says I should start paying a lot more in rent if I wanted to keep living here." My father had left the house to my mother outright, a decision made from love and trust, a trust Rick was now systematically dismantling. My dad's life insurance policy, a respectable sum meant to ensure my mother's security for the rest of her life, became Rick's personal slush fund. A new 70-inch television appeared in the living room. He bought a jet ski he used exactly twice before it sat gathering dust in the garage. They took a trip to Cancun, and my mother sent me photos of herself, smiling a wide, desperate smile, holding a margarita a foot tall, while Rick stood beside her, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder, his eyes unreadable behind dark sunglasses. I knew that money wasn't just my father's legacy, it was my security, too. I was supposed to go to graduate school. My father and I had talked about it for years. Now, that dream was being drunk away on a beach in Mexico. The tension in the house grew thick and suffocating. My presence was an inconvenience, a silent judgment on their new life. Rick started making passive-aggressive comments in my presence, talking to my mother as if I wasn't even there. "Sarah, I just don't know if there's enough room for a young woman to find her own way when she's still living under her mommy's roof," he'd say, stirring his coffee. "It's not healthy for her." He was a master manipulator, framing his cruelty as concern. He painted me as a freeloader, a child clinging to the past, when all I was doing was trying to hold on to the last remnants of the family I'd lost. The arguments with my mother became more frequent, more vicious. She was a different person when he was around, her spine dissolving, her opinions replaced by his. She would defend him with a ferocity she'd never shown for me. "You don't understand him, Chloe," she would shout, her face twisted in a mask of frustration. "He saved me. I was drowning, and he saved me," I wanted to scream back. "He's not a lifeguard, Mom. He's an anchor, and he's pulling you down to the bottom with him." But the words would catch in my throat, strangled by a grief that was still too raw. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday night, almost a year to the day after my father's death. I came home from work late, exhausted from an 8-hour shift, followed by a 3-hour class for a certification I was pursuing. The house was quiet. I found a note on the kitchen counter written in my mother's looping, overly ornate script. "Chloe, Rick and I need to talk to you. We'll be in the living room." My stomach plummeted. I walked in to find them sitting side by side on the sofa, a united front. Rick was in the center of the couch, my mother perched on the edge of the cushion as if she were a guest. He was the one who spoke. "Chloe," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "your mother and I have been talking, and we've decided it's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. He gestured around the room, a grand, sweeping motion. "This is our home now. We're building a new life together, and frankly, your presence is making that difficult. It's time for you to find your own place." I stared at him, then turned to my mother, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Mom?" I whispered, the single word a desperate plea. She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on a loose thread on the sofa cushion, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's for the best, honey," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "You're a grown woman. It's time." The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This was my home, the home I was brought back to from the hospital, the home where my father had taught me to ride a bike on the driveway and catch fireflies in the yard. The pencil marks charting my height were still on the doorframe in the pantry. And she was choosing him, a man she'd known for less than a year, a grifter who had dismantled my father's memory piece by piece, over me, her daughter, her only child. "I have 2 weeks," Rick said, his voice flat and final, "to pack your things and go." I looked at my mother one last time, searching for a flicker of the woman who had raised me, the woman who had kissed my scraped knees and read me bedtime stories. But all I saw was a stranger, her face a blank mask of acquiescence. The love I had for her curdled into something cold and hard in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just turned and walked out of the room, each step echoing in the cavernous silence of a house that no longer felt like home. The war had begun, and as I packed my life into cardboard boxes that night, surrounded by the ghosts of my childhood, I made a silent, chilling promise to myself. They had taken my past from me. One day, I would come back and take their future. The first year on my own was a special kind of hell. I found a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex in North Austin. the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of stale curry and desperation. The rent was more than I could comfortably afford, but it was all I could find on such short notice. My salary as a junior analyst was just enough to cover my bills, with almost nothing left over. I ate instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, counting every dollar, my bank account a constant nagging source of anxiety. I worked my 9-to-5 job, then went straight to my evening classes for the data science certification, getting home after 10 most nights, my brain buzzing with code and statistical models. On weekends, I picked up shifts waiting tables at a Tex-Mex restaurant on 6th Street, slinging margaritas and platters of sizzling fajitas to tourists, my feet aching and my smile plastered on. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. The exhaustion was bone deep, a constant weary ache that settled behind my eyes. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the emotional desolation. The sense of betrayal was a living thing inside me, a cold, heavy stone in my gut. My mother had my phone number and my new address, but she never called. She never texted. It was as if the moment I walked out the door of the house on Primrose Lane, I had simply ceased to exist for her. I saw updates on her Facebook page, which I morbidly scrolled through in my darkest moments. Pictures of her and Rick on a new boat on Lake Travis, the caption reading, "Living our best life." Photos of them hosting a barbecue in my backyard with a crowd of Rick's loud, boorish friends. They had repainted the front door a hideous shade of flamingo pink. They had torn out my father's beloved rose bushes and replaced them with a gravel pit for a fire pit. Each photo was a fresh stab of the knife, a reminder that they were actively erasing every trace of my father and of me. The silence from my mother was the cruelest part. It confirmed what I already knew. She had made her choice. She had chosen the easy, numbing comfort of Rick's presence over the messy reality of her daughter's grief and disapproval. I was the inconvenient mirror reflecting what she had lost and what she was becoming. It was easier to just get rid of the mirror. In my isolation, something inside me began to change. The soft, wounded part of me, the part that cried at night, started to harden. The grief didn't disappear, but it crystallized into something else, something sharp and focused. Rage. A cold, clean, motivating rage. It was that rage that got me out of bed in the morning when my body screamed for rest. It was that rage that fueled my long nights of studying, my eyes burning as I stared at my laptop screen. I wasn't just working for a better salary anymore. I was building an arsenal. Every dollar I saved, every skill I acquired, was another bullet in the chamber. My first breakthrough came from a place I least expected it. I was working on a project for my firm, analyzing real estate market data for a big investment client. I was building predictive models, forecasting property value fluctuations in various Austin neighborhoods. I became obsessed, staying late, running my own queries, teaching myself the intricacies of mortgage-backed securities, title law, and shell corporations. I discovered I had a knack for it, an intuitive understanding of the complex interplay of finance and property. I saw the way the wealthy used LLCs and trusts to move assets, to buy and sell anonymously, to protect themselves, and an idea, a dark and ambitious seed, began to take root in the scorched earth of my heart. I started following the Travis County property records online, setting up an alert for the address on Primrose Lane. It was a long shot, but I had a growing suspicion that Rick's lifestyle was unsustainable. The life insurance money, as substantial as it was, wouldn't last forever, not with the way they were burning through it. My suspicions were confirmed about 18 months after they kicked me out. A friend of my dad's, a kindly man named George, who lived 2 streets over, called me out of the blue. He sounded hesitant, uncomfortable. "Chloe, it's George Miller," he said. "Listen, I don't want to be a gossip, but I thought you should know. There's a new sign in your old front yard, a big one." My blood ran cold. "What kind of sign, George?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A foreclosure notice," he said softly. "The bank posted it this morning." My heart hammered in my chest. Foreclosure. They hadn't just spent all the money, they had remortgaged the house. They had taken the last tangible piece of my father's legacy, the home he had worked his entire life to pay off, and they had offered it up on the altar of their own greed. Rick had likely convinced my mother to take out a huge home equity loan, promising to invest it or start a business, and had instead squandered it. The bank was coming to collect. The rage that filled me was so potent, so absolute, it was almost clarifying. This was it. This was my chance. But I had to be smart. I couldn't just swoop in and buy it at auction. They would see my name. They would fight it. No, my revenge had to be subtle, surgical. It had to be a trap of their own making. For the next few weeks, I watched the county records like a hawk. I saw the foreclosure process halt. Then, the foreclosure notice was taken down and replaced by a for sale sign from a local real estate agency. They had managed to scrape together enough money, or tell a good enough sob story, to convince the bank to let them sell it themselves to pay off the loan. They were desperate, and desperation makes people careless. By this point, my life was vastly different. I had finished my certifications and been promoted twice. I was now a senior data scientist at a major financial tech firm in the domain. I was making excellent money. I had been living like a monk, saving over 70% of my income, my savings account, growing into a formidable war chest. I spent a week consulting with a sharp, discreet lawyer who specialized in real estate law. Following his advice, I created a limited liability company. I called it Sabine River Holdings, LLC, a deliberately bland and anonymous name, registered to a P.O. box in a different county. I opened a separate bank account for the LLC, transferring the funds I would need. I was now, for all intents and purposes, an invisible, faceless corporation. I hired a cutthroat buyer's agent, a woman named Brenda, who had a reputation for getting her clients exactly what they wanted, no questions asked. I told her I was an investor looking for a rental property in the Round Rock area. I never told her my connection to the house. She was just a tool, a means to an end. The stage was set. The players were in position. I watched the listing on Zillow, my heart a cold, steady drumbeat in my chest. The pictures were galling. They showed the pink front door, the gravel fire pit, the cheap, ugly furniture Rick had bought. The description talked about the potential of the property. I saw the price drop. Once, twice, a third time. No one was biting. They had let the place go, and the photos couldn't hide the neglect. George had told me the lawn was overgrown, and the paint was peeling. They were running out of time. They were getting scared. And that's when I told Brenda to make the offer, a lowball offer, almost insulting, but just high enough to be their only way out. I was offering them a lifeline, and they had no idea it was attached to an anchor that would drag them straight to the bottom. The negotiation was a masterclass in psychological warfare, fought entirely through proxies. Brenda, my agent, was a shark. She relayed their agents' counteroffers to me with a dry, dismissive tone. "They're crying poverty," she told me over the phone one afternoon, "saying your client is trying to rob them blind." The husband got on the phone with his agent and started yelling. Real piece of work, apparently. I felt a grim smile touch my lips. The husband, Rick. I could picture him perfectly, his face turning that blotchy red it did when he was angry, spitting and fuming about the injustice of it all, completely oblivious to the fact that the person he was railing against was the kiddo he had so casually discarded. Their first counteroffer was laughably high, a desperate attempt to recoup some of their squandered cash. Through Brenda, I rejected it flatly, without a counter of my own. We just said, "No thank you. The initial offer stands." We let them stew in that silence for 48 agonizing hours. The strategy was to make them feel the icy grip of the alternative, foreclosure. The bank's auction would be a public humiliation, and they would likely get even less than what my LLC was offering. Their agent called Brenda back, his voice significantly less confident. They came back with a second counteroffer, much closer to my original bid. "They're asking for you to cover all closing costs and waive the inspection," Brenda said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "They're trying to squeeze every last penny out, but waiving the inspection is a big tell. It means they're hiding something they know is broken and can't afford to fix." "Tell them we agree to cover closing costs," I said, my voice steady. "But we will not waive the inspection. However, we will agree to buy the property as is, regardless of what the inspection turns up. The offer is final. They have 24 hours to accept it." It was the perfect lure. I was giving them the certainty of a sale while calling their bluff on the inspection. I already knew what was wrong with the house. George had told me about the leaky roof over the back porch and the HVAC unit that was on its last legs. I didn't care. The house's structural integrity was irrelevant. Its symbolic value was everything. The 24 hours passed in a slow, torturous crawl. I barely slept, my mind racing. Had I pushed too hard? Would Rick's ego make him self-destruct and reject the offer out of sheer spite? Then, late the next afternoon, my phone rang. It was Brenda. "Congratulations," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "You're officially under contract. They folded. They signed everything an hour ago." A wave of something cold and triumphant washed over me. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was the chilling satisfaction of a complex machine clicking perfectly into place. I had them. They had willingly, eagerly signed their own eviction notice. They just didn't know it yet. The next few weeks were a flurry of paperwork, all handled by my lawyer and my agent. The inspection report came back, and it was even worse than I'd imagined. The foundation had a crack on the west side, there was evidence of termites in the garage, and the plumbing was a disaster waiting to happen. To any normal investor, it would have been a money pit, a reason to run for the hills. To me, it was a testament to their neglect, a physical manifestation of how they had desecrated my father's memory. It only strengthened my resolve. The most surreal part of the entire process was the closing. Because I was buying through an LLC, I wasn't required to be there in person. My lawyer was authorized to sign on behalf of Sabine River Holdings. But they had to be there. They had to sit in a sterile title company office in a strip mall off I-35 and sign away the deed to my childhood home. I knew I couldn't resist seeing it. I parked my car across the street, in the lot of a mattress store, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I watched through tinted windows as they pulled up in Rick's ridiculously oversized, heavily financed pickup truck. My mother got out first. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, her shoulders slumped, her face etched with lines of stress and worry. Rick emerged from the driver's side, strutting with a false bravado that didn't quite mask his own anxiety. He was wearing a tight, lime green polo shirt. Even from a distance, he looked like a parody of a successful man. They walked inside the glass doors of the title company, and I imagined them sitting at a long, polished table, scribbling their signatures on document after document, handing over the keys to a faceless corporation, feeling a sense of bitter relief. They thought they had narrowly escaped disaster. They thought they were getting a fresh start, a pocket full of cash to continue their destructive lifestyle somewhere else. They had no idea they were walking out of a home and into a cage I had spent 2 years building for them. The final piece of the trap was the leaseback agreement. It was Brenda's brilliant suggestion. "Most sellers need some time to move out after closing," she had explained. "We can offer them a 60-day leaseback. They'll pay rent to your LLC. It will make them feel secure, like they have time to find a new place. It will lower their guard completely." So we did. We drew up a standard Texas rental agreement, and they signed it without a second thought. They were now tenants in my house. The closing funds were transferred. The deed was recorded with Travis County. The house on Primrose Lane was mine. Legally, unequivocally, mine. For 60 days, I did nothing. I let them live there, paying rent into my LLC's bank account. I imagined them celebrating their narrow escape, planning their next move, spending the leftover cash from the sale. I let them get comfortable. I let them believe they were free. I wanted the fall to be as shocking and as absolute as possible. I let the calendar pages turn, each day a slow, deliberate tick of a clock counting down to their oblivion. The final week of the lease arrived. I had my lawyer draft a formal notice to vacate, citing the end of the lease term. It gave them the legally required 3 days to move out. I mailed it via certified mail, so I would have a record of their receipt. The trap was now sprung. All I had to do was wait for the final, satisfying click. The silence in the days following the delivery of the notice to vacate was deafening. I imagined the scene, the mailman arriving, my mother signing for the certified letter, the confused look on her face as she opened the cold, legal document. I pictured her showing it to Rick, the slow dawning of horror as they realized this wasn't a renewal offer. This was a command. Get out. I'm sure they tried to contact the landlord. They would have called Brenda, my agent, who had been instructed to block their numbers the day the lease was signed. They would have looked up Sabine River Holdings, LLC, only to find the P.O. box and the name of my lawyer as the registered agent. They would have called him, and he in turn was under strict instructions to simply state, the owner is exercising their legal right to not renew the lease. The tenants are expected to vacate the property by the date specified. They were screaming into a void, their panic echoing in a bureaucratic maze I had designed specifically to disorient and defeat them. The final day of the lease arrived. It was a Friday, the last day of August, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a Texas thunderstorm. I had hired a locksmith, a burly, no-nonsense guy named Mike, to meet me at the property at 9 a.m. sharp. I also, on the advice of my lawyer, had a Travis County constable scheduled to arrive at 9:15 to keep the peace during a potentially volatile tenant removal. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted an execution. I wanted it to be swift, legal, and absolute. I pulled up to the curb at 8:55. My old home looked tired. The flamingo pink door was faded, the lawn was patchy and brown, and one of the shutters on an upstairs window was hanging crookedly. Rick's pickup truck was in the driveway, along with my mother's sedan. They were still there. Of course they were. They probably thought they could just stay, that the faceless corporation would have to go through a lengthy, formal eviction process. They underestimated their opponent. I got out of my car, my hands surprisingly steady. I was wearing a charcoal gray business suit, my hair pulled back in a severe bun. I wanted to look like what I was, the owner. The locksmith, Mike, pulled up right behind me. He got out of his van, carrying a heavy metal toolbox. "You the owner?" he grunted. "I am," I said, my voice clear and even. "Let's get started." We walked up the cracked concrete path, the same path I'd scraped my knees on 100 times as a child. As we approached the front door, it swung open. It was my mother. Her face was a mess of confusion and fear. She saw me, and for a second her expression didn't register. She was looking at a woman in a suit, not her daughter. Then recognition dawned, and it was followed by a wave of pure, uncomprehending shock. "Chloe?" she stammered, her hand flying to her mouth. What are you doing here?" "Hello, Mom," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. I held up the set of keys, the original keys my father had given me, which I had kept, and the new, uncut keys for the deadbolts Mike was about to install. "I'm here to change the locks." Her brain couldn't seem to process the words. She just stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open. From behind her, Rick appeared in the doorway. He was shirtless, wearing a pair of wrinkled cargo shorts, his face puffy with sleep. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "What the hell is this?" he snarled, stepping in front of my mother protectively. "You can't just show up here, you're trespassing." "Actually," I said, taking a deliberate step forward, "you are. Your lease expired at midnight. As the owner of this property, I'm exercising my right to take possession." Rick let out a short, barking laugh. "The owner? You're not the owner. We sold this house to some investment company." "That's right," I said, allowing myself the smallest, cruelest of smiles. "Sabine River Holdings, LLC, of which I am the sole proprietor. You sold your house to me." The color drained from his face. The smug arrogance vanished, replaced by a sickly, greenish pallor. He finally understood. He looked from me to the locksmith, to the constable's cruiser that was just pulling up to the curb. He saw the sheer, inescapable totality of the trap he was in. It was my mother who finally broke the silence. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "No, no, you can't. Chloe, please. You can't do this to us. This is our home." And that's when the years of pain, of betrayal, of lonely nights eating ramen noodles and crying myself to sleep finally boiled over. Not in a scream, but in a voice as cold and sharp as splintered ice. "Your home?" I said, my eyes locking with hers. "You lost the right to call this your home the day you told me to get out, the day you chose him over your own daughter. This isn't your home. This is my father's home. And you let this parasite, desecrate it. You sold it off to fund his pathetic little life. You thought you were selling it to a stranger? You were. We became strangers the day you put me out on the street." I turned to the locksmith. "Mike, if you please." He stepped forward, and Rick, for all his bluster, shrank back into the house. He was a coward, and my mother was a broken woman. The fight was over before it even began. I stood on the lawn and watched as the constable calmly explained to them that they had 10 minutes to gather their personal necessities and leave the premises. All other belongings would have to be retrieved by appointment. My mother began to sob, a deep, wrenching sound that held no power over me anymore. Rick was shouting, threatening lawsuits, his voice cracking with impotent rage. The constable, a man who had clearly seen this 1,000 times, just stood there, his expression bored, his hand resting casually on his belt. They emerged a few minutes later, carrying a duffel bag and my mother's purse. They were forced to walk past me. My mother wouldn't look at me, her face buried in her hands. But Rick did. He stopped, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You will regret this," he hissed. I just looked back at him, my face a perfect, serene mask. "I don't think I will." They got in their truck and peeled out of the driveway, leaving a strip of rubber on the asphalt. I stood there on the lawn, listening to the sound of Mike's drill as he removed the old lock, the lock Rick had touched 1,000 times. The sound was like music. It was the sound of my past being scrubbed clean and my future being secured. The weeks after I took back the house were a blur of frantic activity. The place was a disaster, far worse than the inspection had revealed. Rick and my mother had lived like squatters. There were cigarette burns on the hardwood floors my father had so carefully maintained, a fine layer of grease coating the kitchen cabinets, and a smell of stale beer and decay that clung to everything. The beautiful garden in the back was a wasteland of weeds and trash. It was as if they had tried to physically destroy every happy memory contained within those walls. For the first 2 days, I did nothing but clean. I rented a huge dumpster and filled it with every piece of furniture, every dish, every scrap of fabric they had brought into the house. I tore out the stained carpets and threw away the ugly curtains. I wanted to purge the house of their presence, to exorcise the ghosts of the last 3 years. Then the real work began. I hired contractors to repair the foundation, replace the roof, and install a new HVAC system. I had the entire house rewired and replumbed. I spent weeks scraping that hideous flamingo pink paint off the front door, sanding it down, and staining it back to the warm, welcoming oak it had been when I was a child. Every day after work, and all through the weekends, I was there, covered in dust and paint, rebuilding my home from the inside out. It was exhausting, expensive work, but every swing of a hammer, Every stroke of a paintbrush felt like an act of reclamation. I wasn't just fixing a house, I was healing a wound. I found the pencil marks in the pantry, the ones that charted my height from age 3 to 16. They had tried to paint over them, but I carefully, painstakingly, stripped away the cheap latex paint and revealed them again. I replanted the rose bushes in the backyard, finding the same variety my father had loved at a nursery in South Austin. Slowly, piece by piece, the house on Primrose Lane began to feel like home again. It started to feel like his home. During this time, I had no contact with my mother or Rick. My lawyer handled a few terse communications regarding the retrieval of their belongings. They sent a moving company to pick up their junk, and I made sure to be absent that day, leaving the movers with a list of what they were allowed to take. According to my lawyer, Rick had called him multiple times, alternating between threats and pathetic attempts at negotiation, asking if the new owner would be willing to sell the house back. My lawyer simply hung up on him each time. They had no legal leg to stand on, and they knew it. They were adrift, their lifeline cut. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, via my dad's friend George, that they were staying in a cheap, extended-stay motel off the highway. Rick's fancy truck was repossessed a month later. They were broke, the money from the sale of the house gone, swallowed by the deposit on a new rental they'd likely lost, debts they owed, and Rick's insatiable appetite for useless things. Their downfall was as swift as it was predictable. I finally moved back into the house in the spring, nearly 6 months after I'd kicked them out. The first night I slept in my old bedroom, the walls painted a calming blue, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings in the air. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet that wasn't filled with grief or rage, but with a profound sense of rightness. I had done it. I had taken back what was mine. I had defended my father's legacy, and, in the process, I had discovered a strength in myself I never knew I possessed. I was no longer the wounded girl they had cast aside. I was a fortress. The call came a few months after that, on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on the back porch, on a new swing I had installed in the exact spot the old one had been, reading a book and listening to the wind chimes my dad had loved. An unknown number flashed on my phone screen. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. I didn't say anything. The line was silent for a moment, and then I heard a choked, hesitant voice. "Chloe?" It was my mother. I didn't respond. I just listened. "Chloe, please," she said, and I could hear the desperation, the raw, scraping sound of someone at the absolute end of their rope. "He's gone. Rick's gone. He left last week. He took what was left of the money. He took my car. I have nothing, Chloe. I'm staying at a shelter. Please. I have nowhere else to go. Can I please just come home?" Home. The word hung in the air between us, a universe of meaning packed into 4 letters. She thought this was still her home, that after everything she had done, after the choices she had made, that my love was a door she could just knock on and expect to be opened. I thought of the girl she had thrown out, the daughter she had abandoned for a con man. I thought of the years I had spent clawing my way back, rebuilding my life, while she was living in my father's house, erasing his memory. I listened to her shallow, ragged breaths on the other end of the line, the sound of a woman drowning in the consequences of her own actions. The wind picked up, and the chimes my father had hung from the eaves of the porch began to play their gentle, random melody. The sound was peaceful, pure, and clear. It was the only sound I wanted to hear. The end.